Hello, my name is Brian Joseph Lee. I'm the director of Public Forum, and welcome back to Creative Activism, a day of art, ideas, and action. Next up, we have an interview with noted playwright and poet Claudia Rankine, who discusses her new book, Just Us, her experience navigating the worlds of academia and the American theater, and her vision for working across difference to create change. This session is moderated by artist, activist, scholar, and author P. Carl. Take a look.
Thanks so much, Brian. I know Claudia and I are both really happy to be here, part of the Public Forum's Creative Action Summit. And we're just going to start talking. Yeah, Claudia?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Hi, Carl. How are you?
Great to see you on your. I know you've been off on the book tour, which really doesn't mean off anywhere. You've been on Zoom for the book tour. Your book Just Us is out, and I thought it'd be great to just start our conversation. I really love the way the book starts with the question. It's like I guess a poem, but the question of what if, and it's really about what if change. And I just wondered maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that. You in that poem kind of name all the barriers and then imagine what if. So we might start there.
Yeah, maybe I'll just read it.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Perfect.
That way we don't have to imagine what it says. What does it mean to want an age-old call for change, not to change? And yet, also, to feel bullied by the call to change. How is a call to change named shame, named penance, named chastisement? How does one say, what if, without reproach? The root of chastise is to make pure. The impossibility of that. Is that what repels and not the call for change? That opening poem really was meant to engage this question of how people say they want change, but then resist these moments of change. They see protest as riots, even in, like, wait a second. So I wanted the book to start in the imaginative trajectory of moving forward beyond the resistance to the call for change.
The one thing that I was struck by in the poem is the word pure, that there is a kind of a culture among us, and I really mean in all directions, of a kind of chastisement about what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, how we're doing what we're doing. It is a really such a divisive time in the country, and you see that division in all areas, and it has this feeling of we have to get it right this time, and then the question becomes, what does right look like? So I know for myself, I really think a lot about what does right look like, and where does it look right in what context? And I kind of wondered about your use of that word.
Sure. I think I wanted to start out with the place of impossibility. Yeah. That this notion that there is a right way towards change that will accomplish everything on everybody's bucket list, to me seems a little bit defeating the self before you even get started. One of the things I loved about the civil rights period, where you had the strategy of Martin Luther King, you had the strategy of Elijah Muhammad, you had the strategy of Malcolm X, you had the Black Power movement, you had so many different people moving forward in whatever way they imagined change, and they weren't trying to stop the other person. They might have disagreed with the other person, but everybody went forward and did what they could do in the way that they could do it. And this is something I've spoken to the writer and activist Sarah Schulman about a lot, because she talks about it relative to ACT UP New York during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And one of the things she said to me that has stuck with me is that ACT UP never told anybody they couldn't do something. If you wanted to go to the church and do a die-in, you could do that. If you wanted to work in the insurance company to try and get coverage for people who were having symptoms that weren't listed as AIDS related, you could do that. You could, whatever you wanted to do, however you wanted to attack the problem at hand, that's what you did. And people wouldn't join you if they weren't interested in joining you, but nobody stood in your way. And we are in a curious time now, because it's such a divisive landscape, where people are wanting to stop this and stop that, and then it creates an impossibility of movement. I mean, what's happening with the protests, fantastic, but that's one way. There are other ways to move. There are people inside institutions and companies that are working for change, and that's another way. So I wanted to use that word pure to say there is no purity of method or achievement. It is always going to be messy, because people are messy. And we're in a culture that is an old culture that has entrenched ideas. Some people, we will never, ever change their minds about anything because they are insane.
Yeah. Because they're infecting bleach. That is how we know. I think that idea of how we really allow each other space to sort through these issues, how we talk about them. I think there's been a lot of questions around, and you and I've had this conversation many times, whose work is it to do? Should white people be talking amongst themselves and doing their own thing and their own work? And what is the role of discourse among us, and you name the book Just Us, and I think about that a lot, because I wonder, and I wonder sometimes if it's a white privilege thing to think we have to all be in conversation with each other. I mean, as a trans guy, I don't just want to talk to trans people. I want to be able to understand why people feel, the fallback of racism as, as a kind of weapon that they can use at their will. I mean, you and I've had that conversation about Amy Cooper, who weaponizes race and knows how to do it. And so it's not always just people who are in the KKK per se, but it's a culture that's learned that. And then what does it take, to unlearn that, and how do we do that, apart and together?
Yes, this whole thing around whose job it is to do anything, to me seems the wrong question. It's one of those claims that seems to be, it has an automatic answer. Of course, we are all responsible to the future. It's no one person's job, and there's no one way to go at it. If a person wants to say, look, I personally cannot work with white allies, that's their choice, and they can come up with another way to do the work that they need to do. I personally, and I'm speaking wholly for myself, obviously, I think an institution like white supremacy that began with segregationist policies that, it spent a lot of time putting in place policies, legislation, housing laws, you name it, to create segregationist ways of life to prevent us from working together. So I am not interested in continuing the structure that was handed to me by white supremacy. I will take help from wherever it comes. If somehow Mitch McConnell woke up and had a moment where he was like, oh my God, what was I doing? Claudia, what can we do together? I might be willing at that moment to move forward. I mean, that is.
I hope
that is so far on the fantasy side that I don't even have to worry about that. But my point being that I personally think that even as we make our own choices, we really want to, what was it? Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And segregationist attitudes is the master's tool. So I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in coalition building, in working with anybody who will work with me, in talking, having discourse around these subjects, and in moving forward. I'm not interested in critiquing other Black people who feel differently from me, because they're not my problem. They're not the people who are putting in place mechanisms of surveillance, of murder, etc. So if that's how another person wants to do it, if they need to work on their own, then they should work on their own. But for my own purposes, I am not interested in that. And another way of thinking about this is that people have been disappointed by white liberals for forever, and it's not that these liberals are actually worse than the worst conservative. The worst conservatives are worse. But the liberals are more disappointing because they put themselves forward as sharing an agenda, and then suddenly, as white people, they go white and begin to replicate the structures that inevitably will lead to my demise. So that, so I think that kind of hesitancy to work with white liberals comes from a history of being disappointed again and again and again by them. But our own family members disappoint us. So I think if we want change, we're going to have to create a we that's larger than just us. And as for, Black women, 97% voted for Hillary Clinton. 97% of Black women were able to say, this is not what we want. What has happened, we didn't have to wait till it happened to know that it was going to happen. We knew this in 2015. Why other people, white men, the 62% who voted for Trump, and we can talk about that. And those people, I think they voted for what they wanted. I think it wasn't a mistake. I think they are invested in a structure that centralizes their power and their positions and themselves.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is so much a part of this conversation, and why I think segregating out is so difficult, is that we're all intertwined in capitalism and dependent upon it. I think one of the reasons white liberals are so disappointing is who wants to give up that advantage, right? I mean, I think any kind of justice, any kind of equity, people have to give things up to get that, right?
Exactly.
It's not just having good intentions. It's not just voting. People have to legitimately give up things that are comfortable, that they rely upon as, you know, their own soothing things. That, and I think the intertwining of capitalism is also complicated because, you know, even I mean, we're all living in that. So Black people are not escaping that. And, you know, it's interesting in this moment, one of the really wonderful things that is happening is that people are beginning to say, oh my gosh, we have to hire Black people. And like we haven't had that conversation for 30 or 40 years, but suddenly it's actually happening. And you and I were talking the other day, we were laughing that it's actually reached the tennis channel, which means that, you know, pretty much we've solved the racism problem if there's somebody, a Black man doing a commentary on the tennis channel. And I think the question becomes, when integration is also integration into capitalism, then, you know, how will things change based on new bodies in old positions, right? So that question of, representation being central to change, but also where does systemic change come from, and what do white people have to give up to get really systemic change?
Exactly. I was thinking as you were speaking that I wonder how different things would have been if instead of affirmative action, it was called equity action. You know, that if the desire to create equity included all of us, and that's what we were working towards, rather than tokenism, then maybe the change in language would allow for a different kind of investment in where we were going, if that makes sense. Because I think that one of the mistakes we've seen in the past is that people have thought, I'll hire one Black person, I'll check that box off, and we're done. And it had nothing to do with how equity worked in their companies or their institutions. It had nothing to do with their own commitment to anti-Blackness. So I think we also need to start changing the language around what we want. And there's a lot of talk now about, you know, white people should be able to feel discomfort and hold discomfort and be uncomfortable. To me, that's not quite it. It's more what you're saying. It's about capitalism. It's understanding the ways in which racism and capitalism work together and how to change that dynamic. And so it might mean giving some stuff up, but that's stuff that you shouldn't have had in the first place. You know, so I think these different ways of talking about things might help us as a we in our different publics. Not that we will become one public. We will always have various publics, but those publics can join together as a we in terms of the desire to create equity within our communities.
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting that when you start to try to have that conversation, which I have often with my students, you know, of various races and ethnicities, but oftentimes, you know, a fair number of white students, when you really start to talk about what giving up means, I don't think Americans know how to talk about that. Like the whole system that I teach in, the whole the theater that I've worked in for 20 years, these are all based in progress narratives, right? And progress narratives are based in advancement. And I think, so when I'm talking to a 20-year-old about, well, what are you going to give up? All they're thinking about is what they're going to get. And I don't mean that selfishly. I just mean that that's what you do when you put yourself into college so that you can engage capitalism with all the benefits that you need to do it. And so I think that to your point, we've been asking a lot of the wrong questions.
Exactly.
And I think that's for me, and I find when I ask those questions, it's not something anybody knows how to really answer. And so, you know, to your poem at the beginning of the book, you also use the word bullying. The minute you say that, people feel, well, what do you mean? You know, they feel bullied by the thought that they took something they shouldn't have taken, and it's not about some individual action. It's about this notion of inheritance that we as white people have not wanted to acknowledge.
And it's funny because this whole idea of legacy and inheritance somehow is dropped out of the script in favor of the Horatio Alger narrative, the bootstrap narrative of I climbed my way to the top. And even if it was my grandfather who climbed his way to the top, or my father who climbed that becomes the narrative. I worked really, really hard. And I think even Black people then gave that narrative to Black children. You know, you're going to go to school and the teacher's going to be racist, but you're going to work twice as hard. You're going to get the same thing or less, but you're going to work twice as hard. So this idea that you are able to get through it if you work twice as hard is another version of the same bootstrap narrative. Like somehow you, Carl, can work a little bit and then you'll make it. And I, Claudia, I'm going to work twice as hard and then I'll make it. And then, you know, and then those people who didn't work hard or twice as hard, the fact that they didn't make it, that's on them. Yeah. So we have to get beyond that narrative and think of one that, this is why I'm falling back into the language of equity, but think of narratives that take into account the ways in which the society at large has, what's the word when in sports when you get a handicap?
Yeah, handicap.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
When that we have been handicapped in different ways. And that has to be taken into account. I mean, when you think about the wealth gap, my $10 to your $100. For every $10 I work, you get $100. And that leads to the house you can buy. It leads to whether or not you're renting your entire life. It leads to how precarious you are in this moment, which leads to how angry you are in this moment and how vulnerable you are in this moment when you have a time without leadership where the country has intentionally been led into being unprepared for the vaccine that has wiped out almost 200,000 people. So I think we have to, it's, you know, it's redundant, but I think we have to get back to actually beginning again, naming again, reinvesting in different approaches towards things.
Yeah, I think about that even in working, you know, in a college setting and thinking about again asking the wrong questions. I think of all the trainings. I mean, the thing that's of course I think most frustrating about this particular moment, the you know, fascist leadership aside, the thing that's most frustrating about this moment is I think for people that have been thinking about this issue for a long time, it feels like repetition, right? And so it's been funny. I'm teaching this course, and I'm a theater course, and I'm teaching sort of these parallel worlds in the theater, which is one is teaching about pandemics and a pandemic play, and we're reading Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, and then looking at a play like Twilight from Anna Deavere Smith, and you could literally rip off the cover to Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year written in the 1600s, and rip off the cover of Twilight written in 1992, and just put 2020 on the covers of both of them, and it's like nothing has changed. And and of course it's not nothing, but the conversation has not changed.
Exactly.
And when I went back to read Twilight, because I hadn't thought about it in a while, it just shook me to my core to think we were asking the exact same questions. So something that we've been doing, because I can say from my perspective as a white person, I've been in a lot of trainings, done a lot of readings, I've seen seen the theater particularly say it's investing in equity and inclusion for a long time. So it's not like this just suddenly popped up, right? And when you look at something like Twilight, and I mean the whole thing about police being able to put somebody in a chokehold is one of the questions in the book. That's 1992, and so I think the real the real frustration, and also, but I think the challenge is to say, we can't just do what we've been doing, right? Because we've already been doing that, and yet there's George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the list goes on, and so that's the part that I think for me I feel most challenged by. Like and so sometimes when I see like demands for change, we need more training, we need more of this, it's like, yes, we do, but what actually unearths these structures that just fall back into place almost the moment you upend them for a minute, and yeah. So anyway, that's been I just wonder, like, what does it look like to try to take this moment and do it differently?
Well, I think it looks like risk, right? It means that you're going to do things that don't have a certain outcome that you can see set in place, but you're going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. So here's a fantasy thing. I'm not saying anybody should do this or is doing it or will do it, but what if, we as culture makers have asked actors and technicians and all kinds of people to live in a precarious way so that we can maybe one day ask them to be involved in our project. And then they're supposed to drop everything and come and work on our musical or our tour or our this or our that. And then when it's over, our relationship is over. So how can the entire, for example, theater community, not a single theater, but theater community, work together to create a way in which those people, all of them, have a basic living wage no matter what's happening in their lives? Now, that would mean that fundraising would work differently. It would mean that people wouldn't be always working on a thing to get compensated. It would mean maybe flattening out fees so that people get paid less here, but all the time. You know, but it can be done. But we have the kinds of asks that we have made to creatives in this country is insane. And we are seeing that insanity now. Now, when people are finding themselves in positions where they are, where there's precarity around housing, there's precarity around food, there's precarity around their own ability to take care of their own health. And who do they go to? Who do they ask? Who will help them? So as a community, I think we need to, like, that should be our priority right now, not creating product to entertain people who are in their houses.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, there's lots of stuff on Netflix they can watch. But that's what I mean. It's like, what risks can we take in order to stabilize the community that we depend upon?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is because in so many ways the institutions that house the theater work exactly the way the Bootstrap world works, right? It's every theater for themselves. And one thing I've seen over 20 or more years working in the theater that's always, I've never really understood it. I think maybe because I didn't start as a theater insider, which is I've never understood the lack of real, honest, like collaboration. I don't mean, oh yes, a company co-produces with another company or that. Yes, those things happen, but that every theater has its own fundraising department, its own marketing department. There's no sense that we are in it together as a community, to your point, and we don't have any structures in place to change that. And even when now we hit this moment of this, crash of a pandemic and just incredible racist violence and a mass movement, we've hit that. There's still no ideas on the table that I've seen. Maybe there aren't and I'm wrong, but there's no ideas on the table to say we're broader than, it's like we're broader than the family, our own family. We're bigger than the single theater that we work in. And I think the only way that you really mess up the Bootstrap's notion of capitalism, I got what I got, is you actually have to change the sense of who you're connected to. Right. And I keep thinking about this in terms of the pandemic. I mean, 200,000 people have died, and we have not discussed that at all as a country, right? 200,000 people, and we know it's going to come and get us. It's going to come and get us. We don't know how yet, but it's going to come and get us. And that is, to me, such a representation of our lack of our sense of connection at a national level. But then, the theater can't brag of being any different than that, right? The publishing world can't brag of being any different than that. And so the arts, in one way, perpetuate the same ideas. And I think the nonprofit sector often does that with some kind of virtue signaling, because we're not in it for the money, but yes, we are. And so I think this idea of broadening our notion of who we're connected to is really the only way that we will see each other differently. So.
Yeah, I think, we need to stop thinking in scarcity with a scarcity mentality and sort of this is ours, and be able to open out to our greater communities and trust, and that's the other thing, it takes trust. Mm-hmm. And there's a way in which no one trusts anyone. Everyone is trying to see what they can get for themselves. It's too bad. I mean, I think it comes down to that. And there are people out there who are doing, I know one institution has hired a number of artists during this period to think about how to approach art making in the future. And those are real jobs that they have given them. So there are people out there thinking beyond just production and thinking in terms of creating equity within the field itself.
Yeah, you know, I just been thinking about, because I kind of in the midst of a lot of looking at the history of how white men talk to each other, and I keep thinking about how even in the most beneficent situations of white men trying to do supposedly good things, that there's a kind of language of rationality around how change happens. And one thing I think about is that the great trauma narrative, white men have created a trauma narrative that they've turned into logic and rationality. And so we're living in this idea that that certain ways of behaving are logical, and those ways are actually built on mistrust, right? And I think so that's the sort of logic. And then the people that go, gosh, the people that feel in trauma are the people that don't understand this logic, but the logic is really trauma. And so I think that us beginning to change the language in which we speak, and really thinking, and you and I've had this conversation, because logic means nothing when you're talking about race, when you talk about survival, right? Like, and so what happens is we do a diversity training, or if you feel you're in survival mode, my words might pierce you in a way that I never intend, because I can never know what your body feels from my words, right? Like, I think I'll think, oh, I didn't say anything. Did I say something to upset you? And I think us not understanding the ways in which language works on bodies is really systemic racism and white supremacy and white masculinity, creating a notion that we live in some version of the head, and that language, if you string the sentences together right, you should understand what I'm saying. And that, as your work points out, and Isabel Wilkerson and all of the people who've been writing just incredible books just coming out this year, we just forgot our history, so that we only remembered the language that suited the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative is the thing. As James Baldwin said, if you can change one word in the sentence, you can change the reality, One of the things as you were speaking, I was thinking about Fairview, and the ways in which, as you know, in Fairview, the actor asked the audience to move, the white people in the audience to move from their seats and stand on stage so that they could create in the space of the audience a space for Black people and people of color to exist aspirationally, something that doesn't exist in the world. And so the ask is such a small ask for like 5 minutes. Will you get up from your seat and stand, instead of sitting there, will you go and stand there? And when I was at the play, at Jackie's play, I was thinking, when people say no to this small thing, how can I expect them in the world to do anything that matters? Anything. If this small inconvenience, you can sit here for 5 minutes or you can stand there for 5 minutes. And you had white people saying, no, I can't do that. And I won't do it because it feels like tokenism. So this idea of it's too much of a tokenist gesture. So this gesture I can't stand it in the imagination. So how, if I can't practice it in the imagination, how the hell am I going to do it in real life?
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I mean about the disappointment of white liberal America. Yeah. The unwillingness to even try a thing out, to do the what if of a moment, even in an imaginative space. So if that's impossible to think, then the shift in the narrative is impossible to make. Yeah. Yeah. You know, that because that's how you start it. You start it in the imagination, and then it becomes a new story that can be told and can be enacted.
Yeah, that's really the brilliance of that play, is to, you know, is to imagine how that could happen, and then to see that resistance. I think it really makes me think about how, you know, people are in survival mode even in 5-minute increments. Like this is threatening in some way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you think, well, what is threatening about this 5 minutes? Like, how will this undo you in your place in history or in society? And yet something about it's about the ask, and I keep thinking about this word now that we have in our culture called anti-maskers. Like, isn't it weird that that's a word? People who won't wear masks in the pandemic, you know, an anti-masker, because we are in the 5 minutes that you walk into the store to grab milk. We want you to put a mask on, you know, so that people can live, and that is somehow, you know, breaking in on their notion of their freedom, and that the 5 minutes could really test their whole ability to survive as free in the country, you know. And I think Jackie's play really did that in a kind of similar way, and now you see it playing out, and it's so crazy. Like, it's just crazy. It's crazy. And you, as we all know, the people that are sitting in that play are white liberals, you know, so we know that they think of themselves as good people, not terribly racist people. And yet that 5 minutes is, but then those same liberals think of the anti-maskers as insane, but you know, we're all afraid of our 5 minutes of letting go.
Did you see that Barr said that that slavery was the only thing that was worse than having to wear a mask?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, what? And
do you think he's just having us on? He's like, I'm going to go say this in public.
Yeah.
And so those silly liberals can be like outraged.
Yeah, I mean that, and if all the people, if you don't count the people who died in blue states, the number isn't so high in COVID. I mean, we've lied to ourselves so much about our history that honestly, I mean, we've gone and, you know, it is a kind of psychosis in the entire culture, and I think that is, I mean, if not now, when, right? Because we've gotten so far from reality, and it's a reality that Black people have known for a long time, that the erasure, right? And white people are like, Tulsa, Oklahoma, we didn't know, when did that happen? Yeah, I mean, just all of these omissions over time that we now have to somehow let in, and this is the great impingement on freedom. I mean, the reason that you know, half of the government is saying nobody should teach the 1619 project, which is absolutely the most ridiculous notion imaginable, that we can't have conflicting or additive notions of history, and so each effort at kind of incremental change seems to pose such a great threat. And I think it's that that we have to be willing to give up that 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then 15, and then 20, you know.
Yeah, and you know, it's the resistance is intentional because the omission was intentional.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, it's not as if they're resisting a radical change. The history is the history. The omissions were made in order to centralize whiteness, to create a narrative that says that the benevolent white people were here just to make America great. And so those, even as they were acting, they were subtracting.
Yeah.
So everything was being done, and then the history books were taking them away. My favorite moment of late was a Black woman who said, it's okay to take down the monuments, the Confederate monuments, because my body is the best monument you'll ever get.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's moving around, so it'll follow you wherever you go. So, don't worry about it.
Don't worry. There's Pedro Almodovar has a documentary about Franco in Spain, and in Spain the people that Franco murdered are living underneath the highways. So people can actually go in Spain and go to a highway and say, my mother is down there, right? And so there's a whole movement to excavate these bodies, and several times over, Spain passed a law of forgetting. They passed a law, you will forget, right?
Yeah, and Poland did the same thing.
Yes, yeah, but an actual law of forgetting. And so I was talking to my students about the monuments, and for a moment they're like, well, the monuments are, I think they thought I was saying they should stay up so we won't forget. And I was like, no, the monuments are the forgetting.
Right.
The monuments are the forgetting, and the woman who's walking around is the remembering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's good. Well, as always, I could sit and chat with you for many hours, as we often do, and I just want to say, I really do want to say, Claudia, the book is really. It's a piece of art, as always. It's more than a book. I keep saying it should be a museum exhibit in the way that you've laid it out. And I think one of the great acts of activism over the last many years has been your writing. It certainly has had a great impact on many people, myself included, and I really feel like that gift of activism has made a dent in how we talk about race in America. So it's really and I kind of was just amazed that you can write one masterpiece after another. So thank you for that. Really.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Claudia and P. Carl, for that fantastic conversation. You can find Claudia's new book, Just Us, and P. Carl's book, Becoming a Man, wherever you get your fine literature, so definitely check it out. Up next, Creative Activism continues with an in-depth conversation with playwright and MacArthur Genius Grant Fellow Dominique Morisseau. This session is co-broadcast with our friends at WNYC's Green Space. Check it out.